There are stories you were never meant to hear, stories so venomous, so sharp-edged, that they cut into the bones of history and bleed truths no one wanted remembered, and tonight you will hear one of them. Kentucky, spring of 1855. A grand plantation rises from the bluegrass hills, its white columns gleaming like the teeth of a predator. Inside that house, 7 members of the same family wither and die, their bodies blistered, their minds unraveling, their skin burning as if their very clothes had turned against them. And maybe they had, for each victim wore garments sewn by the same pair of hands, the hands of a woman known only as Dinah, a slave, a seamstress, a scientist of revenge. Before I take you further down this tunnel of hidden history, tell me in the comments right now, where are you watching from? I want to know. Every place, every state, every man who hears this story tonight becomes part of a brotherhood of forbidden knowledge. Now listen carefully, because what I'm about to tell you is not just a ghost story from the past. It is a revelation about power, control, and the secret ways the oppressed sometimes strike back against their oppressors. And once you hear it, you will never look at history the same way again. The Caldwell plantation was no ordinary estate. It was an empire, 2,300 acres of tobacco, hemp, lumber, and bourbon. It stood like a citadel of southern wealth, feeding the hunger of Louisville markets, shipping whiskey as far north as Chicago, as far south as New Orleans. The man at its helm, Samuel Caldwell, was cold precision wrapped in flesh. To his neighbors, he was a model of business acumen. To those he owned, 57 enslaved souls, he was an architect of cruelty. He calculated slavery the way a banker calculates profits, every hour of forced labor measured, every act of resistance punished with cold efficiency. His wife, Margie Arrett, was no gentler. She had been raised in the Virginia planter aristocracy, trained to see enslaved people as machinery that required maintenance. Her discipline was as cruel as it was polished. Their children, Thomas, Mary Elizabeth, and young Samuel Jr., carried the family's arrogance like an heirloom. And behind them all loomed Constance, the aged matriarch, still sharp-minded and merciless, a woman who believed absolute control was the natural order of things. To this family, Dinah was not a woman. She was a tool, a needle, a pair of steady hands. Her skill as a seamstress was so legendary that plantation ladies begged for her work. The Caldwells dressed like royalty because Dinah's stitches made them so. Her embroidery was whispered about across counties. She was, by all appearances, the perfect servant. But appearances are a mask. Behind her lowered eyes and quiet obedience, Dinah was studying, watching, calculating. She had knowledge no one suspected. Her mother had taught her to read in secret. Books stolen from the Caldwell library became her teachers: chemistry, botany, medicine. While the family saw only her bowed head bent over fabric, she was weaving another pattern in her mind, a pattern of vengeance, a science of hidden death. What no one knew was that Dinah had already begun her work. Every gown she tailored, every jacket she stitched carried more than thread and fabric. She had learned how to soak threads in solutions of poison. She had mastered the art of binding venom to the very seams of clothing, so that when skin pressed against it, when sweat opened pores, the toxins would seep into the body. Invisible, silent, inevitable. And the family that had owned her life was about to wear their deaths like a second skin. So remember this as we descend. History doesn't just belong to the victors. Sometimes, hidden beneath the official story, there are re-victories carved out in shadows, written in silence, stitched into the very fabric of time. The Caldwell plantation was a fortress of wealth built on human misery. Rising above the rolling fields of bluegrass, its mansion loomed like a marble tombstone, 6 columns whitewashed against the sky, a house not of grace but of domination. Every brick of it had been laid by hands that were never paid. Every acre of it had been soaked with the sweat of men and women whose names were not written in ledgers, only their numbers. By 1855, Samuel Caldwell owned 57 enslaved people. To him, they were not men and women, they were units of production. He recorded them the way he recorded barrels of whiskey or bales of hemp. Samuel spoke of maximizing output and reducing waste, the way modern executives speak of profits and losses. His cruelty wasn't fiery, it was clinical, mechanical. A lash delivered not from rage but from calculation. Punishment was simply a corrective measure. The man had turned human suffering into a science, and his wife Margaret mirrored him perfectly. The daughter of Virginia's tobacco aristocracy, she brought with her 12 enslaved souls of her own, along with the ideology of her upbringing, that black bodies were not human beings but intricate tools, requiring maintenance, care, and when necessary, brutal discipline. She ruled the household as Samuel ruled the fields, with an iron hand disguised in refinement. Their children embodied the future of that empire. Thomas, the eldest son, 22, fresh from the halls of Transylvania University, was training in law and politics. He dreamed of standing in Kentucky's legislature to defend slavery's honor. He inherited his father's calculation but carried it on a sharper edge: ambition. His cruelty was more personal, more vicious. He beat enslaved men not to maintain order but to feed something inside himself. Mary Elizabeth, their daughter, was 20 years old, beautiful by the Shah's low standards of southern aristocracy, and engaged to wed into another powerful plantation dynasty. Her marriage was a political alliance, her wedding dress intended not just as fabric, but as a banner announcing the union of two empires of blood. The youngest, Samuel Jr., at 17, was already a master of control. He watched, learned, practiced. He spoke little, but he measured everything: how long it took men to pick a row of tobacco, how many hours a woman could work before she faltered, how fear could be used to bend the will of another human being. Even at 17, his eyes were predator's eyes. And over them all hovered Constance, Samuel's widowed mother, 74 years old. Frail in body but strong in mind, she carried the traditions of an older world, where the authority of the master's family was unquestioned, where disobedience was crushed like a snake beneath a boot heel. She had lived through the transformation of Kentucky from frontier wilderness to plantation empire, and she still whispered in her son's ear about the old ways. This was the house Dinah lived in. This was the cage she had been born into. And yet, unlike many, Dinah had weapons hidden in her mind. Her mother had broken the law of silence and taught her letters. Books became her allies: chemistry, botany, medicine. To the Caldwells, she was a seamstress, silent, skilled, useful. To herself, she was a quiet scholar of death. But the final spark came not from books. It came from cruelty. The winter of 1854 had been brutal. Crops failed. Tobacco prices fell. Samuel Caldwell tightened the noose on his enslaved workers. Longer hours, less food, harsher punishment. Hunger gnawed through the quarters. Whippings grew more frequent. And in that season of cold and cruelty, Samuel made a decision that broke something inside Dinah forever. Her daughter, Sarah, 14 years old, one of the few children Dinah had managed to raise to that age, Samuel announced that Sarah would be sold to settle a gambling debt his son Thomas had racked up. Just like that, a child stripped from her mother's arms, her body and soul thrown into the unknown hell of the Deep South. Dinah had endured much in her life. She had bent her back under their demands. She had hidden her mind behind lowered eyes. But this was too much. Something inside her, something that had endured years of chains, snapped free. That night, she did not sleep. She sat in silence, staring at the needle in her hand, a seamstress's tool, a symbol of servitude. But she began to see it differently. The needle was a weapon, the thread was a delivery system, and the fabrics of the family who had destroyed her life would become their shrouds. Her plan was born not out of rage alone, but of something colder, sharper: strategy. She would not strike with fire or blade. She would not rebel openly and die quickly. She would make their own vanity, their own wealth, their own silks and satins, the very instruments of their undoing. They would wear their deaths. And as the winter turned to spring, Dinah began to prepare. She gathered plants from the fields and forests. She studied their properties, extracted their essences, concentrated their venom. Pokeweed, sumac, jimson weed, mushroom toxins. She tested them in secret, binding them to threads, learning which would last, which would burn, which would kill slowly. She stitched in the daylight with calm obedience, and in the dark hours before dawn, she prepared her poisons. Every gown, every jacket, every garment she made in the coming months would carry her secret mark. The Caldwells had enslaved her body, but now, through her needle, through her science, they would pay. By March of 1855, the plantation's mansion was alive with activity. The spring social season was coming, and Margaret Caldwell demanded an entirely new wardrobe to showcase her family's prosperity. Dresses for luncheons, gowns for evening gatherings, riding habits for hunting excursions, and of course, a new silk gown for Mary Elizabeth's upcoming wedding. The household buzzed with fittings, fabric deliveries, and Dinah's steady needle pulling thread through cloth. To the Caldwells, Dinah's work was devotion. To Dinah, it was war. For months she had experimented in silence. She knew which plants blistered skin, which sapped strength, which spread through the blood like fire under the skin. She discovered how to bind those toxins into thread so they could not be seen, smelled, or felt until it was too late. And now, with the family demanding more clothes than ever, she had her chance. She began with Margaret. The emerald green silk gown was a masterpiece, its bodice hugged tightly, the sleeves ballooned in the latest Parisian fashion, the hemline sweeping just enough to whisper across polished floors. It was meant to dazzle the ladies of Fayette County, but every inch of the neckline, every seam at the cuffs, every point where fabric would kiss bare skin, had been sewn with thread soaked in poison, a silent venom waiting for warmth and sweat to open the body's door. On March 12th, Margaret wore it proudly to a luncheon at the home of Judge Beaumont's wife. For 4 hours she basked in compliments, unaware that death was stitching itself into her flesh. When she returned home that evening, she complained of itching along her neck and wrists. A trivial irritation, she thought. Perhaps the starch, perhaps the fabric. But by morning, the redness had spread. Blisters rose like burning stars across her skin. She summoned Dr. Harrison Beaumont, one of Lexington's most respected physicians. He examined her carefully, puzzled. It looked like a rash, perhaps an allergic reaction. He prescribed salves, rest, patience. He had no idea that her own gown had betrayed her. While Margaret's condition worsened, Dinah remained the picture of composure. She expressed concern, even offered to sew softer cotton garments for Margaret's comfort. Her calmness, her apparent loyalty, made suspicion impossible. And Margaret was only the beginning. Thomas demanded new formal wear for a political rally, a morning coat, a vest, trousers that would declare him the image of Kentucky's slaveholding future. Dinah stitched them with meticulous precision, her poisoned threads buried deep in the seams. He wore them proudly, standing before a crowd in Frankfurt, proclaiming the eternal right of his family and his class to own other human beings. As his voice thundered about power and order, the toxins whispered into his bloodstream. Days later, lesions appeared on his chest. Fever gripped him. He raged, cursed, but no physician could explain his decline. Samuel Jr., preparing for a hunting trip, requested riding clothes, sturdy, tailored, fit for a young master. Dinah obliged. His jacket and trousers were lined with threads more concentrated than Margaret's gown. When he rode out across the fields, his skin rubbed against the seams, sweat seeping the venom into him. Within days he was bedridden, his torso covered in sores that would not heal, pain like fire beneath his skin. Mary Elizabeth, still planning her grand wedding, demanded the most exquisite gown Dinah had ever made. Satin, lace, embroidery, yards of fabric to announce her union with another dynasty of power. To Dinah, it was the ultimate canvas. Every fold, every pleat, every hem was laced with death. The wedding dress would not just be a symbol of aristocratic wealth, it would be the shroud of a Millie's legacy. By April, 3 members of the Caldwell family lay sick in their beds. The symptoms were the same: burning skin, fever, delirium, lesions spreading across the body, yet the disease touched no one else. Not the house slaves who washed their garments, not the neighbors who visited, not the doctors themselves, only the family. Dr. Beaumont was baffled. This was no contagion, no plague. The illness struck selectively, precisely. He noticed with growing unease that each attack began after the patient wore a new garment. But how could clothing itself kill? The idea seemed unthinkable. Unthinkable to him, but not to Dinah. Each night, as the family moaned in fevered sleep, Dinah sat in her sewing room, her candle flickering against spools of thread and folded fabric. To anyone who peeked inside, she was the picture of loyalty, laboring long hours for her masters. But in truth, every stitch was a declaration of war, every thread was a blade, every gown, every jacket, every dress, an execution waiting to unfold. The Caldwells had turned her daughter into a commodity, a debt settled with flesh. Now Dinah was turning their wealth, their vanity, their very symbols of power, into poison. And the house that had stood like a fortress was beginning to rot from the inside. By mid-April of 1855, the Caldwell mansion was no longer a place of power. It was a place of dread. The house that once rang with polished laughter and the clink of crystal glasses now echoed with coughing, fevered cries, and the restless footsteps of doctors pacing the halls. Margaret's skin had turned raw and blistered, her once proud face scarred with angry welts. She hid herself in shawls, humiliated that beauty had abandoned her so suddenly. Thomas lay in his bed, fever rising and falling, his sheets stained with the seep of unhealing sores. His arrogance had curdled into rage. He lashed out at servants, struck them when they moved too slowly, screamed at the doctors who could not explain his illness. Samuel Jr., barely 17, had been confined to his chamber, his body trembling with pain, his voice a weak whisper of protest. Only Mary Elizabeth still clung to her illusions of grandeur. She pressed forward with her wedding plans, demanding her gown be finished on schedule. She told herself that her family's affliction was a passing fever, an unlucky coincidence. But Dinah knew better. She saw the quiet horror spreading through the house like a shadow at dusk. The physicians grew more desperate. Dr. Beaumont called again and again, examined each patient carefully. He could find no contagion, no consistent cause, no explanation that satisfied logic. What haunted him most was the pattern. Every sickness began after the wearing of new clothes. Margaret's emerald silk, Thomas's formal wear, Samuel Jr.'s riding suit. Could fabric itself be the source? The thought gnawed at him, but without tools of chemistry, without microscopes capable of detecting what Dinah had bound into the threads, he had no way to prove it. Meanwhile, whispers spread across Fayette County. Neighbors began to murmur that the Caldwells were cursed. Some said the land itself had turned against them. Others whispered of divine punishment, that God had finally turned his eyes on a house built with blood. But the Caldwell pride would not allow such talk to enter their halls. They clung to dignity even as their bodies betrayed them. And through it all, Dinah moved silently. She fetched water, prepared food, dressed wounds with calm precision. She spoke softly, offering comfort, never drawing suspicion. To the Caldwells, she was loyal as ever. To herself, she was the hand guiding their descent. Her mask was flawless. The greater their suffering, the deeper her composure grew. For Dinah knew, the truest power is not loud, it is invisible. But power never moves unnoticed forever. Constance, the matriarch, sharp-eyed even in her frailty, began to study Dinah more closely. She watched the way Dinah lingered over the sewing table, how her fingers moved with ritual care across the spools of thread. She noted the strange timing of the illnesses, how they followed each new garment as surely as night followed day. Suspicion stirred in the old woman's mind, though she did not speak it aloud, for Constance believed in control, in dominance, in the certainty of white supremacy. To imagine that a slave, a woman no less, could orchestrate such devastation was unthinkable, and yet her instincts whispered otherwise. The house was fracturing. Servants whispered in the quarters at night, voices low, afraid, yet tinged with something dangerous, hope. They saw their masters weaken. They saw sickness gnaw away at the invincible family that had ruled them for generations. Fear of discovery mixed with secret satisfaction. The air in the quarters was different, charged, tense, alive. But inside the mansion, fear ruled. Every morning brought new lesions, new fevers, new delirium. The Caldwells had built their empire on domination. Now they were dominated by something unseen, something they could not fight, could not whip, could not sell. They were helpless, trapped in their own fortress, wearing death on their very skin. And Dinah, the seamstress, sat by her candlelight, her needle sliding silently through fabric. Every stitch was another step in their slow burial. Every knot tied the noose tighter. She had become what they never believed she could be, an architect of destiny. The Caldwell Empire was collapsing, not from rebellion in the fields, not from fire or blade, but from threads of poison too small to see, yet strong enough to strangle a dynasty. And still, the worst was yet to come. By late April, the Caldwell household had transformed into a place of contradictions, fevered cries behind bedroom doors, yet preparations for grandeur unfolding in the sewing room. For while Samuel Jr. lay moaning in agony and Thomas raged at the limits of his body, Mary Elizabeth refused to abandon her wedding. To her, the gown was more than fabric. It was destiny. It would bind two of Kentucky's most powerful families, securing wealth, prestige, and control for generations. She demanded perfection, and Dinah gave it to her. But beneath every fold of satin, beneath every loop of lace, Dinah wove a secret no one could see. This gown was not simply a dress, it was an execution disguised as elegance. Mary Elizabeth chose ivory satin imported from Charleston, trimmed with Brussels lace and decorated with embroidery that shimmered in candlelight. She demanded hundreds of tiny pleats, each stitched with precision. Dinah bent over the fabric for weeks, her needle flashing in silence, her face calm as stone. But her threads were alive with death. This was her masterpiece. Every hem, every cuff, every seam carried toxins chosen with scientific precision. The bodice, tight against the torso, was stitched with threads soaked in pokeweed extract, designed to blister and burn. The waistline carried oil from poison sumac, meant to seep deep into the skin. The lace sleeves were bound with compounds from Jimson weed, their alkaloids designed to crawl through blood into the mind, creating delirium, hallucinations, madness. And the veil, the veil. Its delicate embroidery had been kissed with toxins so subtle they would not act at once, but spread slow, invisible, like whispers from the grave. Mary Elizabeth marveled at the gown, holding it up before the mirror, turning it in the light. Perfection, she declared, and Dinah bowed, silent, her lips curved in the faint shadow of a smile. Meanwhile, panic gnawed deeper at the family. Margaret's scars had worsened. She hid her face from visitors. Thomas slipped further into fever, his dreams tangled with visions of fire and insects crawling under his skin. Samuel Jr. could no longer rise from his bed. Constance hovered like a ghost, demanding answers no physician could give, and Samuel the patriarch paced his halls like a man possessed, his empire collapsing around him, his control slipping through his fingers. Neighbors began to whisper more loudly now. Why was it only the Caldwells who suffered? Why not their servants, their visitors, their neighbors? Was it punishment from heaven, or something darker, something too terrible to speak aloud? In the quarters, the whispers turned into something else, a dangerous kind of hope. Some said the family was cursed. Others said Dinah had been touched by spirits, that the ancestors had given her power to strike back. No one dared speak openly, but eyes flicked toward her with reverence. Fear mingled with awe. She was no longer just a seamstress, she was becoming a legend. But inside the mansion, suspicion was closing in. Constance's sharp eyes lingered longer on Dinah's work. She saw the care, the ritual, the way the woman bent over her threads as if weaving a spell. She said nothing aloud, for to accuse a slave of such cunning was almost unthinkable, and yet, in her silence, she began to watch. Still, Dinah never faltered. She delivered meals, she adjusted pillows, she read aloud letters from neighbors in her soft voice. Her mask of loyalty remained unbroken, but in her heart she knew the wedding would be the climax, the moment when the family's vanity and ambition would seal their fate. Each night, as the candle burned low, Dinah worked in solitude, her hands stitched with patience, her mind cold with purpose. The gown grew piece by piece, every fold a weapon, every seam a whisper of vengeance. When it was finished, Mary Elizabeth would walk not into marriage, but into a death ceremony, a union with the grave. The Caldwells had enslaved Dinah's body. Now, with the needle they had given her, she would enslave their destiny. The wedding day approached like a tightening noose. May of 1855 arrived heavy with heat, the air thick and restless. The Caldwell estate stood like a wounded animal, proud in posture but rotting within. Inside its walls, fevered cries blended with the measured click of Dinah's needle. Death and elegance were being stitched side by side. The mansion was split between two realities. Upstairs, Margaret, Thomas, and Samuel Jr. lingered in half-lives of pain. Margaret wore gloves to cover her ruined hands and scarves to hide her blistered throat. Thomas slipped into delirium, alternating between roaring at servants and whimpering like a child in his fevered dreams. Samuel Jr. lay shivering, too weak to rise, his eyes wide with terror whenever he looked at his own mottled flesh. And yet downstairs, preparations for Mary Elizabeth's wedding surged forward. Florists delivered arrangements of roses and lilies. Bakers brought sugar, spices, and flour for cakes to feed 300 guests. Tailors from Lexington delivered suits for the groomsmen. The house was sick, but the wedding would go on. It had to. For the Caldwells, power was performance, and the wedding was meant to declare that their dynasty would endure. But power was slipping, thread by poison thread. Dr. Beaumont visited daily now, his face gaunt from sleepless nights. He carried the weight of a mystery he could not solve. He had begun keeping notes in a private ledger, recording each symptom, each garment, each strange coincidence. His mind circled the same unthinkable thought, that the clothes themselves were to blame. But how? He dared not voice it, not yet. For to suggest that the Caldwell wealth, silks, satins, fineries, was their executioner was to shatter the order of things. And Beaumont, though shaken, was still a man of his time. Order mattered more than truth. Constance, the matriarch, was less bound by hesitation. She prowled the halls like a hawk, her eyes sharp and suspicious. She studied Dinah as she worked on the gown. She noted how the woman's fingers lingered on the thread, how her expression never changed no matter the suffering around her. Constance's mind whispered possibilities she dared not voice. To accuse Dinah of sorcery or poison would be to admit that a slave held such power, and that for a woman like Constance was nearly unbearable. Yet she watched. Always, she watched. Dinah felt those eyes, but she did not falter. Her mask of obedience never slipped. She smiled faintly when spoken to, bowed her head at commands, offered comfort in soft tones. All the while the gown grew closer to completion, its ivory folds hiding death more intricate than any blade. The servants whispered more boldly in the quarters now. Some believed God himself had chosen Dinah as his instrument. Others said she was guided by the spirits of Africa, ancestors reaching across the ocean to strike at the Caldwells through her hands. A few, fearful, said she had made a pact with darker powers. But whatever the explanation, one truth united them all. Dinah was no longer simply a seamstress. She was becoming myth. And still the mansion sank deeper into chaos. Guests who came to check on the Caldwells left unsettled, whispering that the family seemed cursed. The more Samuel insisted the wedding would display Caldwell strength, the more his neighbors smirked behind fans and muttered behind brandy glasses. Power thrives on appearances, and appearances were crumbling. Mary Elizabeth, oblivious or willfully blind, demanded that nothing interfere with her ceremony. She ordered pearls sewn into her gown, a train long enough to sweep the aisle like a queen. She told herself she would step from her sickened house into a life of grandeur, but she never noticed the quiet smile that flickered across Dinah's lips as she nodded in agreement. By the second week of May, the gown was nearly finished. It hung in Dinah's sewing room, ivory and radiant, shimmering in candlelight like the robe of a saint, but the saints it served were older, darker, and merciless. Every seam was a promise, every stitch a curse. The Caldwells prepared for celebration, Dinah prepared for burial. The wedding day loomed. The morning of May 19th, 1855, dawned with a sky of pale blue and an air heavy with magnolia blossom. Guests arrived in polished carriages, women in silk gowns, men in tailored suits, all eager to witness the union of two dynasties. The Caldwell mansion, draped in flowers and ribbons, shone with its old grandeur, though its walls still whispered of sickness. Inside, chaos simmered beneath the polish. Margaret, her face half-shrouded in lace, forced herself into the drawing room to greet guests, though her voice trembled. Thomas could not rise from bed, nor could Samuel Jr., their absence explained away with murmurs of fever and indisposition. Samuel Caldwell himself stood tall, masking his fatigue with brandy and bravado. He had staked everything on this day. The wedding would prove the family's strength, even if death itself lurked in the rafters. And Mary Elizabeth, radiant in her gown, was the center of all. She stood before her mirror, ivory silk cascading over her body, lace sleeves whispering against her skin, the veil shimmering like gossamer. She admired herself with tears of joy. "Perfection," she whispered. "I am perfection." Dinah, who had dressed her, knelt to adjust the hem. Her hands moved with their usual grace, her expression calm, her voice soft when she spoke. "You are ready, Miss Mary." But behind her eyes, a fire smouldered. This was the hour she had stitched for. The ceremony was held in the Caldwell Chapel, its pews filled with Kentucky's elite. The air buzzed with the rustle of silk skirts, the scent of perfume, the scrape of boots on polished wood. The minister stood ready, Bible in hand, his voice echoing as he called for silence. Mary Elizabeth entered to a swell of music, her gown gleaming in the candlelight, her veil trailing behind like mist. Gasps rose from the crowd at her beauty. No one saw the sheen of sweat already budding at her temples. No one noticed the faint tremor in her hands. Dinah stood in the shadows near the back, her head bowed, her lips murmuring words too soft for any to hear. They were not prayers of blessing. As the vows began, Mary Elizabeth swayed slightly, a flicker of dizziness crossing her face. She pressed forward, her pride carrying her through. The bodice clung tight to her skin, and beneath its seams, poison seeped into her blood. Her voice wavered as she repeated the minister's words. The congregation murmured approval, mistaking weakness for emotion. By the time the rings were exchanged, her cheeks had flushed deep crimson, and sweat trickled down her neck. Her breath came faster. She gripped her groom's hand with desperation, but the ritual had to finish, for appearances ruled above all. Samuel Caldwell glared from the front pew, willing his daughter to endure, to hold her mask as he had taught her. She did. She endured long enough for the pronouncement. Husband and wife. Applause filled the chapel. Then the collapse began. Mary Elizabeth's knees buckled. She gasped, her veil fluttering as she fell into her groom's arms. A cry rose through the room. Shock, horror, confusion. Women clutched their pearls. Men surged forward. The minister froze, his Bible trembling in his hands. Samuel Caldwell rose, shouting for doctors, his face purple with rage and fear. Margaret screamed from her pew, clutching her veil to her ruined face. The groom staggered, holding his bride as her body convulsed. Her ivory gown, gleaming a moment before, now seemed like a shroud. Dinah watched from the shadows, her face expressionless. She had stitched this moment into being. The chaos surged like a storm. Guests shouted, servants rushed, doctors fought their way forward, but no one could stop what had already begun. The poison was in her blood, in her breath, in every seam of her wedding gown. Mary Elizabeth's beauty, her vanity, her ambition, all dissolved beneath the trembling weight of her poisoned flesh. Her eyes rolled back, her lips frothed. The bride who had dreamed of empire collapsed at the altar, her gown the instrument of her undoing. The Caldwells' day of triumph had become a funeral, and in the quiet corner Dinah slipped away unnoticed, the faintest curve of a smile playing on her lips. The war was not over, but the battle was hers. The Caldwell mansion, once alive with music and laughter, was now a house of screams. The wedding feast lay untouched, tables heavy with roasted fowl, sugared cakes and champagne no guest dared sip. The chapel's candles burned low, their wax dripping like tears. Outside, carriages departed in haste, wheels clattering down the gravel drive as guests fled the spectacle of a bride collapsing in her gown. Inside, chaos reigned. Mary Elizabeth had been carried to her chamber, her ivory gown soiled with sweat and saliva, her body convulsing against silken sheets. Doctors bent over her, their voices urgent, their hands clumsy with useless remedies, bleeding her with leeches, forcing bitter draughts between clenched teeth. None of it mattered. The poison was in her bones now. Margaret shrieked until her throat gave out, her own ruined skin a mirror of her sister's fate. Samuel Jr., too weak to leave his bed, wept when he heard the news. Thomas raged like a madman, cursing God, the doctors, the neighbors, anyone but himself. Constance hovered in silence, her sharp eyes missing nothing. She said little, but her gaze cut like glass. She was beginning to see. Samuel Caldwell, patriarch and lord of this crumbling dynasty, stormed through his halls like a man possessed. His face blazed red with fury as he barked orders at servants, threatened doctors, cursed his guests for cowardice. "She will live," he roared, slamming his fist against the mantel. "She must live. The Caldwells do not fall." But in his heart, he knew the truth. His empire was rotting from the inside, and no display of power could disguise the stench. By nightfall, Mary Elizabeth's screams had turned to ragged whimpers. Her body lay limp, her once glorious face marred by the invisible teeth of poison. The gown had been stripped away, tossed into a corner like a corpse itself. Dinah, called to the chamber under tea, he pretense of tending, stood quietly near the doorway, her eyes lowered, her expression unreadable. No one noticed the satisfaction buried deep in her stillness. But suspicion was rising like smoke. Dr. Beaumont, pale and weary, retreated to his ledger after midnight. He could no longer deny the pattern. Every affliction began with cloth, garments, gloves, gowns, always the things made by Dinah's hand. His quill hovered as he considered the unthinkable, that a woman enslaved, armed only with a needle, had undone the might of the Caldwells. But even in his private thoughts he could not quite commit it to ink. The truth was too terrible. Constance, however, was not so hesitant. She remembered the way Dinah's hands lingered over the stitches, the calmness in her face as sickness spread. She remembered the faint, secretive smile as Mary Elizabeth left for the chapel, and she felt a shiver in her blood. Constance was a woman of control, of calculation. She had ruled her house in silence for decades. Now she saw that she had underestimated the seamstress who moved like a shadow among them. The servants too felt the shift. In the quarters, whispers no longer spoke only of curses or providence. They spoke of vengeance. Some said Dinah was an avenger sent by the ancestors. Others warned that such power came with its own price, that no one could wield death so deftly without it circling back. Yet in every whispered tale, Dinah was no longer property, she was legend. Through it all, Dinah remained unbroken. She served the family their meals, she fetched basins of water, she spoke when spoken to, her tone gentle, her eyes obedient. But inside her, a fire raged steady and cold. She had pulled at the first threads of Caldwell power, and the whole tapestry was beginning to unravel. Mary Elizabeth lingered at death's door, neither bride nor wife, her body an altar to poisoned silk. The household held its breath, caught between grief and suspicion, between rage and fear. And in the silence of her small chamber, Dinah prepared her next stitch. The war was not finished. The week after the wedding, the Caldwell mansion stood like a mausoleum. Its windows, once lit for celebration, glowed faint and feverish. Guests who had fled whispered across Kentucky. The bride had collapsed at the altar, the family cursed, the dynasty faltering. Neighbors visited less often, and when they did, it was with the curiosity of carrion birds. Mary Elizabeth lingered, her life measured in shallow breaths. She drifted in and out of delirium, whispering fragments of prayers and accusations alike. The doctors declared nervous exhaustion, consumption, fever of the blood, any term that concealed their ignorance, but no cure held. The more she fought, the weaker she grew, her beauty stripped away seam by seam. Samuel Caldwell grew more desperate by the hour. He sent riders as far as Louisville to summon physicians, apothecaries, even a preacher renowned for casting out demons. Yet no one could halt the steady decay. His pride, once his armor, began to curdle into paranoia. He thundered at servants, accused his guests of betrayal, and drank himself to stupor in his study. Behind closed doors, his mutterings grew darker. Someone is poisoning us. Someone in this house. Constance heard those words and did not dismiss them. She had always trusted her instincts, and her instincts pointed to Dinah. For years she had considered the seamstress harmless, a quiet woman who kept her head low and her hands busy. But now, in the wreckage of the wedding, Constance replayed every moment, the faint smile at the chapel, the stillness in the face of calamity, the strange coincidence that every ruin wore Dinah's thread. She began to watch more closely. Dinah felt the gaze but betrayed nothing. She stitched quietly in her workroom, mended sheets for the sick, sewed fresh garments for the household. To all appearances, she was the picture of loyalty, but she knew the matriarch's suspicion was growing. She welcomed it. Suspicion could wound, but it could not undo what had already been done. The poison was not only in the gowns, it was in the Caldwell's name, their standing, their very blood. Dinah had infected them with their own weakness, and no watchful eye could sew that shut. The servants whispered louder now, emboldened by the collapse. In the quarters by candlelight they told stories of Dinah not as seamstress but as conjure woman, as priestess. Some swore she had stitched spirits into the fabric itself, trapping the Caldwells in a curse of their own making. Others claimed she carried no magic at all, only patience and the wisdom of watching where pride was blind. Either way, they spoke her name with awe. But awe was dangerous. Already rumors spread beyond the quarters. A stable boy, loose with drink, whispered to a merchant that the seamstress had cursed the gown. The story traveled faster than fire in summer grass. By the week's end, whispers in town named Dinah as both culprit and legend. Some laughed, dismissing it as slave superstition. Others leaned in close, asking for every detail. Constance heard those whispers too, and they hardened her resolve. She would not let her house be undone by a woman with a needle. Quietly, she instructed 2 servants to search Dinah's quarters. They found little: spools of thread, scraps of cloth, a worn Bible. But Constance knew the absence of proof was proof itself. Clever hands left no trace. Meanwhile, Dr. Beaumont's ledger grew heavier with dread. He sketched diagrams of the afflicted, recorded dates, fabrics, fevers. The pattern was undeniable. He began to wonder if history would even believe him, if such a tale could ever be told. And yet, he feared that telling it aloud would cost him more than silence. By June's first days, Mary Elizabeth had grown so frail she could no longer rise from her bed. Her husband, barely wed, had retreated to Lexington, unwilling to share in the ruin. The Caldwell's empire, once a fortress, was now a crumbling wall, its cracks visible to all who looked. And in her sewing room, Dinah threaded her needle with steady hands, the calm of a woman who knew that time itself had joined her side. The dynasty was unraveling. By midsummer, the Caldwell estate was no longer a seat of power but a stage of decay. Weeds rose in the garden, shutters sagged, and the great halls echoed with silence broken only by coughing and screams. The neighbors no longer called. They whispered instead, of poison, of curses, of a family under judgment. Samuel Caldwell could not bear the whispers. His pride, once iron, had rusted into rage. He prowled the halls like a predator, striking servants with his cane, demanding confessions. "Someone in this house has betrayed us," he roared. But the louder he raged, the more the servants withdrew, eyes downcast, lips tight. His empire was crumbling, and he was powerless to stop it. Mary Elizabeth, the bride turned invalid, now lay skeletal beneath her lace sheets, her breath a shallow rasp. Margaret remained veiled, too ashamed to show her ruined face. Samuel Jr. and Thomas drifted between fever and delirium. The family that once embodied wealth and beauty had become a gallery of ruin. And still, Dinah stitched. Her hands moved steadily, her eyes calm, her demeanor obedient. She fetched water, sewed fresh linens, tended to the sick when called, but her silence now carried weight. To those who watched closely, it was no longer civility. It was sovereignty. Constance Caldwell, matriarch, saw it most clearly. The whispers in town, the murmurs among servants, the pattern in every sickness, all pointed to Dinah. Constance had underestimated her for years. Now she saw what Dinah truly was, not merely a seamstress, but the quiet architect of the family's undoing. So Constance laid her net. She spoke sweetly to Dinah, feigning gratitude, praising her skill. She invited her into the sick room, made her fetch garments, lace, ribbons. All the while Constance's sharp eyes followed her every movement. She sought the proof her suspicion demanded. Samuel, blinded by fury, struck in the open. Constance struck in silence. Between them, Dinah walked like a shadow, untouchable, unseen in her true power. The house of Caldwell was breaking. The patriarch raged, the matriarch watched, the children withered, and Dinah, with her needle and thread, waited for the final stitch. The noose was tightening, but not around her neck. Around theirs, Constance Caldwell moved like a spider in her web, silent and patient. She had watched the ruin unfold, stitch by stitch, and now she could no longer afford patience. Samuel raved, the children decayed, the household whispered of curses, but Constance would not allow her empire to be buried by shadows. One humid evening, she summoned Dinah to the parlor. The candles burned low, casting long, trembling shapes across the faded wallpaper. Constance sat rigid in her chair, veiled in black silk, her hands folded around a rosary she did not believe in. "Sit," she commanded. Dinah obeyed, her gaze lowered. Her hands rested still in her lap, the same hands that had carried needle and thread through every chamber of the house. Constance studied them, as though they held the key to her children's suffering. "You have served this family faithfully," Constance began, her voice smooth as glass. "But faithfulness must be tested. Too many strange coincidences have plagued us. I would have you explain them." Dinah raised her eyes. For the briefest instant, their gazes locked. Two women, bound by power in different forms. Dinah's silence stretched long enough to fill the room. Then, softly, she said, "I do only as I am asked, mistress. I sew what you command." The words were perfect, submissive, yet beneath them Constance felt something sharper, a blade hidden in cloth. That night, Constance ordered Dinah's chamber searched again. She ordered her food watched, her movements recorded. She whispered to Samuel that the seamstress carried secrets. It was the first open step toward accusation, and Dinah knew. But fear did not touch her. She had stitched herself into their ruin too tightly to be pulled out now. The final unraveling had begun. By July, Samuel Caldwell had become a man possessed. His once proud stride faltered into a drunken stagger, his voice a cracked thunder that rattled the halls. He raged at servants, hurled cups against walls, and stormed into sick rooms demanding to know who had cursed his bloodline. "Witchcraft," he bellowed one night, brandishing his cane like a sword. "Someone in this house brings ruin. I'll tear the truth from your throats." The servants scattered like frightened birds, but in the corners of the mansion whispers grew bold. They spoke of Samuel not as master, but as a broken man undone by forces he could not command. And in those whispers, Dinah's name flickered like a flame. One evening, after striking a boy who had spilled wine, Samuel collapsed in the great hall, his face purpled, his chest heaved, and though he rose again, the servants saw it. The patriarch himself was weakening. The curse had touched him. Constance watched her husband's decline with cold calculation. Where Samuel flailed in madness, she sharpened her suspicion into steel. She fed the household's fears carefully, whispering of traitors, of poisoners. Always, her eyes returned to Dinah. But Dinah moved like a shadow beyond their reach. She stitched linens for the sick, wrapped cloth around wounds, bowed when spoken to. Her obedience disarmed even as her presence unsettled. Outside the estate, her legend grew. Stable hands and kitchen girls carried tales to town of a seamstress who sewed sickness into silk, who brought a dynasty to its knees with thread finer than any blade. The Caldwells clutched their crumbling empire, but the world beyond already sensed the shift. Power was slipping, fear was spreading, and Dinah, silent and steady, held the needle. It was near midnight when Constance made her move. The house lay heavy with fevered breaths and drunken snores, candles guttered in their sockets, shadows stretching like claws across the walls. Constance, veiled in black, walked the corridor to the seamstress's chamber with the silence of a mourner. She did not knock. She entered. Dinah sat at her small table, needle in hand, mending a torn handkerchief. The lamplight haloed her face in gold. She did not rise, did not startle, only lifted her eyes slowly to meet her mistress. Constance shut the door behind her. "Enough of this," she said. Her voice was low, cold, stripped of pretense. "My children waste to shadows, my house stinks of death, and always, your stitches, your hands in every ruin, do not think me blind." Dinah laid the cloth aside, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She said nothing. Constance stepped closer, her rosary clutched like a weapon. "Speak. Tell me what you've done. Tell me how you've cursed us, and perhaps God will show you mercy." The silence deepened. Then Dinah spoke, her voice calm as still water. "I do not curse, mistress. I sew. I sew as I have always done. You place the cloth in my hands, and I return it to you. Nothing more." The words were humble, but Constance heard the blade beneath them. She searched Dinah's eyes for fear and found none. Only a steady patience, as if Dinah had been waiting for this moment all her life. For the first time, Constance felt the weight shift. She had entered to unmask a servant. Instead, she faced something larger, something older, something that slipped beyond her reach. Dinah smiled, small, secretive, and returned to her stitching. The following week brought heat so heavy it seemed to press the house into the soil. The air inside the Caldwell mansion stank of sweat, sickness, and liquor. Samuel Caldwell drank from morning till night, each cup another nail in his reason. His cane no longer struck floors alone. Servants bore the bruises of his suspicion. At last, suspicion turned to blood. It happened in the great hall, before the eyes of his dwindling household. Samuel accused a scullery maid of slipping poison into the soup. He struck her down with the silver ladle still hot from the pot. The girl fell screaming, blood staining the marble. The servants froze, terror rooting them in place. Constance rushed forward, hissing for restraint, but Samuel's eyes burned with madness. "They're killing us from within," he roared. "Every hand here is a traitor." In that moment, the estate divided. Some servants fled into the night, carrying tales to town that the Caldwells had turned butcher. Others lingered, trapped between fear of Samuel and awe of Dinah, whose silence had become legend. For she was there, at the hall's edge, needlework folded neatly in her arms. She neither fled nor trembled. She only watched, eyes steady, as Samuel raged and the house shuddered beneath his violence. To those who saw her, she seemed not a servant at all, but the quiet witness of judgment itself. The blood on the floor marked more than one girl's ruin. It marked the Caldwells' final unmasking. Violence had broken free of whispers and shadows. It stood naked in the lamplight, carried by the patriarch himself. And as Samuel collapsed into drunken sobs, Constance lifted her eyes across the hall. They found Dinah. Dinah did not look away. By the end of summer, the Caldwell estate no longer stood as a beacon of wealth, but as a warning. The marble steps were cracked, the garden overgrown, the windows shuttered against the heat. And still the town whispered. Stories spread faster than riders. Neighbors spoke of the bride who wasted in her bed, the daughter who hid behind veils, the sons who trembled with fever. They spoke too of Samuel's madness, how he had struck down his own servant in the great hall, blood spattering the silverware. No amount of money could bribe silence now. The Caldwells were no longer feared. They were pitied, mocked, avoided. And always beneath the gossip another name whispered, Dinah. The tale shifted with each retelling. Some said she had sewn spirits into the wedding gown, spirits that would not release their grip. Others swore she carried roots and powders hidden in her work basket, charms that turned beauty into rot. A few, braver or more faithful, whispered that she was no witch at all, only a woman who had waited, patient as stone, until pride toppled under its own weight. Whatever the truth, her legend outgrew the walls of the mansion. In taverns and market stalls, her story was told with shivers and awe. The seamstress who undid a dynasty, the quiet hand behind the ruin of a name once unshakable. Inside the estate, Samuel raged harder at every rumor, striking servants, cursing the town. Constance, though, understood the danger more keenly. The whispers were a noose tightening around her family's throat, and at the center of it stood Dinah, silent, steady, untouchable. The Caldwell dynasty was not merely unraveling, it was becoming a story, and Dinah was the one holding the thread. Constance Caldwell had lived her life mastering appearances, smoothing scandal, silencing gossip, ensuring the Caldwell name gleamed untarnished. Now, no Polish could save them. The estate reeked of death. Samuel was half mad, and the town watched like vultures. Only one course remained. She must cut out the root. She believed that root was Dinah. Late one evening, Constance summoned 2 of the remaining footmen. Loyal, not by love but by fear, they followed her into the seamstress's chamber. Dinah sat at her table, lamp burning low, hands moving steadily through pale cloth. She looked up once, calm as ever, as the men entered. "Bind her," Constance ordered. The men hesitated. To touch Dinah was to touch the whispers themselves, the unseen force that haunted the household. Yet Constance's voice left no room for refusal. Rough hands seized Dinah's arms. The cloth slipped from her lap to the floor, half sewn, as though abandoned mid-thought. Constance stepped close, her veil brushing against the lamplight's glow. "You will confess," she hissed, "before God and before me. You will name the curse you've laid upon this house, and I will see it ended." Dinah did not struggle. She let the ropes bite her wrists, her dark eyes steady on Constance's pale face. When she spoke, her words were quiet, deliberate. "Confession is for the guilty, mistress. I have nothing to give you." Constance's hand trembled against her rosary. For the first time, she felt the terror that others had whispered. Terror not of witchcraft, but of a woman who could not be broken. That night, Dinah was locked in the cellar. The servants crossed themselves when they passed the door. Samuel raged above, but Constance alone carried the weight of choice. She had bound the seamstress, but not her silence. The cellar was damp, its air heavy with mold and stone. Dinah sat bound in the dark, but if she feared, none could see it. She neither cried out nor begged release. Her silence stretched through the floors above, unsettling the household more than any scream could have done. The servants whispered as they passed the locked door. "She waits," murmured one. "She's calling spirits," said another. No one dared linger too long, but no one dared spit curses at her either. To them, Dinah was no prisoner. She was the force that had already toppled their masters. Above, the house grew restless. Samuel staggered through the halls, roaring for wine, for obedience, for blood. The children wasted in their beds. Margaret, still veiled, swore she heard voices whispering her name in the dark. Every misery was laid at Dinah's feet, yet with each passing day the family weakened further, while she, locked in the cellar, seemed untouchable. Constance alone tried to cling to control. She ordered prayers spoken aloud, holy water sprinkled, charms burned in the hearth. Still, the servants' eyes betrayed doubt. They obeyed her voice, but their faith was slipping. They no longer saw Constance as mistress. They saw her as a desperate woman battling a power too large to master. At meals, the servants muttered Dinah's name like a ward. Some claimed they dreamed of her, seated with her needle, stitching shadows into fine silk. Others whispered she would rise again, stronger for her confinement, and when she did, the Caldwells would fall for good. Constance heard the whispers. Worse, she believed them. For each night she lay awake, she felt Dinah's presence pressing through stone and wood. The prisoner below was no captive. She was the center. The storm broke on a night thick with thunder. Rain lashed the windows, wind rattled the shutters, and Samuel Caldwell, drunk and trembling, seized a lantern and staggered toward the cellar stairs. His eyes burned with the madness of a man who could no longer tell fear from fury. "She's the root," he muttered, cane thudding against each step. "She's poisoned my house, my blood. I'll end her with my own hands." The servants followed at a distance, clutching rosaries and charms, unwilling to stop him, unwilling to draw too near. Constance, pale and rigid, remained at the foot of the stairs. She whispered, "Do not go down, Samuel. Leave her to rot." But Samuel no longer heard his wife's voice. The cellar door creaked open. Dinah sat in the shadows, bound but upright, her back straight against the wall. The lantern light struck her face, calm and unblinking. She did not flinch as Samuel staggered toward her, cane raised like a weapon. "Confess!" he thundered. Spittle flew from his lips. "Say what you've done, what curse you've laid upon my house." Dinah's gaze met his. She spoke with quiet steadiness, each word slicing through the storm. "I need not curse what destroys itself." The cane trembled in Samuel's grip. The servants gasped, some crossing themselves, others falling to their knees. To them, her words were prophecy. Samuel roared and struck. The cane splintered against the wall beside her head. The lantern toppled, oil spilling, flame licking at the damp stone. For a heartbeat, fire and shadow danced across Dinah's calm face. Then silence. Samuel's hand shook. He dropped the cane. He staggered backward, staring as though he had struck not a woman, but an immovable thing, something eternal, unbreakable. And for the first time, Samuel Caldwell fled his own cellar. By morning, the cellar was no longer a prison but a shrine. Word spread quickly through the estate. Samuel had descended in fury, and Dinah had risen untouched. Servants swore they had seen the lantern fall, flames licking at her dress, yet when the fire sputtered out, not a thread had burned. Others whispered she had spoken words that stopped Samuel's very heart, though he still lived, pacing his chamber with eyes wild and empty. Fear became reverence. The cook left bread outside the cellar door. A stable boy laid a small wooden cross upon the threshold, not as protection against her, but as an offering. Even those who once spat the word witch now bowed their heads when they spoke her name. Constance raged at the shift. She ordered the servants beaten for their idolatry, forbade them from speaking Dinah's name. But the more she forbade, the more the whispers spread. Dinah was no longer just a seamstress, nor a prisoner. She was something the household could not contain, the still center of the storm that tore the Caldwells apart. Samuel withered. He drank more, spoke less. At times he would wander the halls, muttering about eyes in the dark, about stitches binding his breath. The children faded further into sickness, pale as ghosts. Yet Dinah, bound in the cellar, grew larger in absence. She had become myth, and myths need no freedom to travel. One evening, Margaret whispered to her maid through fevered lips, "If she made me, perhaps she can unmake me." The maid crossed herself, too afraid to answer. Above the cellar, the Caldwell name unraveled thread by thread. Below, Dinah waited, patient, silent, unburned. The household no longer asked if she would rise. They asked when. By autumn, the Caldwell estate no longer stood apart from the town. Its rot seeped outward, carried in rumor, in servants' tales, in the breath of those who fled its halls. No prayer in the chapel, nor coin in the market could silence the single name that haunted every mouth: Dinah. The town wove her story with a fervor usually kept for saints or devils. Some swore she had survived fire without a scorch. Others claimed she had turned Samuel's hand to ash when he tried to strike her. Mothers hushed their children with warnings, "Behave, lest Dinah stitch your shadow into her cloth." Yet just as many lit candles in secret, whispering her name for protection, as if her patience and power might shield them from sickness and ruin. Merchants told of seeing the Caldwell coach idle, its wheels mired in mud, while a lone figure walked ahead on the road, veiled, dark-eyed, burdened with nothing but a basket of cloth. They swore the coachman dared not pass her, though she never turned her head. The Caldwell name, once gilded, had become a curse. Invitations ceased, debts were called, tradesmen refused their coin. Samuel was mocked in taverns as the master undone by his own seamstress. Constance, hidden behind shuttered windows, heard the laughter echo from the town square, sharper than any knife. And still, Dinah remained locked below, bound by ropes, yet her story moved like smoke through every street and doorway. To the town, her imprisonment was proof of her strength. If chains held her body, it was only because her spirit had already risen beyond walls and gates. The Caldwell's power crumbled, but Dinah's grew, invisible and unstoppable. She was no longer their servant. She was their fate.